Hello everyone, this is David Little, and today we're going to look at a study called Empathy in Adolescence, Relations with Emotional Awareness and Social Roles by Reif and Komodika. The purpose of this study was to develop greater understanding of empathy in adolescence, specifically differences between individuals. The week's reading suggested that understanding the development of pro-social behaviors is especially difficult to measure. For instance, over the past 30 years, studies on antisocial behaviors have outnumbered pro-social behavior studies by a margin of 2 to 1. One of the reasons is that it's much easier to identify and evaluate antisocial behavior. With this particular study, there's been an attempt to understand more deeply the complex emotions as well as social roles associated with pro-social behavior. So I thought we'd start with a few definitions. Self-awareness, as they defined it, is the ability to recognize and appreciate one's own emotions as well as the emotions of others. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. One of the main questions of this study is, why are some children more empathetic than others? And what factors might contribute to that? And finally, individual differences came from the peer group itself. And they were categorized into 3 social roles: the bully, defense of the victim, and the outsider behavior. So it wasn't really addressed in the study, but let's just, for clarification's sake, adaptive empathetic behaviors would suggest defending the victim, and maladaptive would be the bullying response or the outsider behavior response. Aspects needed for individuals to respond in an empathetic way, in this case a person being bullied, are twofold. First, on the intrapersonal level, meaning internally, a person needs to appreciate, be aware of, and understand the importance of emotions in their day-to-day interactions. On the interpersonal level, meaning externally, it is necessary to feel that they, as an individual, have the ability to help the person who is the recipient of their empathy. Also critical to this study was the idea that adolescents will reflect certain social roles in their peer group. And these social roles are an expression of their idea of social justice. Integrating this week's reading in the text would lead us to see this study in the context of psychoanalytical theories, specifically the attachment theory. If a child feels, for instance, consistently protected as an infant, could not that be the origin of the empathetic response observed during adolescence? So, similarly to the idea that adolescent romantic relationships reflect the attachment representations given to them by their parents, the ability to offer empathetic responses might also be a reflection of the social exchanges experienced with a primary caregiver during infancy. As the child grows, the constructionist ideas promoted foremost by Vygotsky become relevant. His ideas value the role of a more knowledgeable other, the zone of proximal development, as well as the idea of scaffolding the child's social behaviors. These theories, as discussed in the text, are complemented as well by the genetic history of the child. So let's discuss the methods. This study was done with 182 children, ages 11 to 16, and they were all located in the central part of Italy. There were 85 boys and 97 girls. This age group was chosen because during this age span, adolescents are able to attain increasing awareness of their own emotional state. Also because a sense of social justice requires a higher level of empathy, which does not normally develop until early adolescence. So the researchers used self-reporting via 3 different assessments. The first was an empathetic questionnaire called Interpersonal Reactivity Index, or IRI. It measured affective empathy or empathetic concern, cognitive empathy or perspective taking, empathetic distress, and then fantasy. The second questionnaire was called an emotional awareness questionnaire. It measured three key aspects of emotional awareness. The first aspect is the willingness to attend to emotions, both your own and others. The second is an external focus, differentiating and bodily awareness. And third, communicating emotions, both verbal sharing and hiding or non-hiding tendencies. Finally, the participant role scales measured 5 roles: the bully, victim, follower of the bully, defender of the bully, and the outsider. And for this assessment, the researchers chose to measure only 3 of the roles of the study: bullying, defender, and outsider. So, moving on to results. As was hypothesized, correlations were demonstrated between empathy and awareness of emotions. Also expected was that appreciation of emotions in self and others, demonstrating both affective and cognitive empathy as well as defense of the victim. Bodily unawareness correlated negatively with both empathetic distress and affective empathy. It was also interesting to note that not hiding emotions was associated positively with both affective and cognitive empathy. Somewhat expected, the female gender demonstrated higher scores in both affective and cognitive empathy as well as defending behavior. Those demonstrating a maladaptive emotional response of outsider behavior were correlated with empathetic distress, which demonstrated a self-focused or self-preservation inclination. Adolescents who were viewed by peers as coming to the aid of others, thereby demonstrating high social roles, scored high in both affective and cognitive empathy. Yet emotional awareness was not related to social roles. Finally, also expected, bullying was negatively associated with cognitive empathy as well as emotional awareness. Let's take a look at a few of the limitations of this study. They include a relatively small sample size, the monocultural sample of the children, and then the empathetic distress scale had a low internal consistency, which meant it didn't consistently correlate well. And then finally, the study really didn't offer conclusions or guidance concerning causality, and of course this is quite important to discover. So let's review a few of the main ideas. First of all, emotional awareness of self and others is important for adaptive empathetic reactions. Likewise, emotional dysregulation can be associated with distress when confronted with the negative feelings of others. Second, focus on their own emotional state and discomfort would seem to limit a person's ability to see the causation of another person's emotional state, which would therefore inhibit cognitive abilities that allow for an empathetic response. So an implication of this study might be that as children are going through their developmental stages, strategies might be implemented in families and schools, focusing on developing the child's awareness of his or her emotional state, and of course the emotional state of others. Third, summary comment is that this finding explaining outsider behavior was of particular interest, and more needs to be understood about the emotional makeup of the outsider's mindset, especially as it pertains to bullying. For instance, coming to the aid of a victim could conceivably be considered harmful by the bullied victim. meaning that an empathetic response might not actually be what the victim appreciates, as it might make them feel even more victimized. This is part of the discussion on page 264 of the text, and might explain the feelings of distress by some adolescents categorized as demonstrating outside behavior. So let's consider briefly some ideas for further study. I think it would be really interesting to learn more about what's going on neurochemically during empathetic prosocial interactions, if that could be studied. I agree with the text that studies looking at the role of fathers and the role that they play in promoting prosocial behavior would be quite helpful. Number 3, studies measuring attachment representations, I think maybe at 12 months, and the cognitive and affective empathy in adolescence would really be helpful to maybe consider the causation question. And then finally, both the study and this week's text suggest that longitudinal studies would offer insight into emotional and social aspects of development. And of course, that would overlap with the idea of measuring attachments. Just a couple thoughts to wrap up this presentation. First is the complexity of emotional responses to specific social interaction remains somewhat elusive. Perceptions can be misleading. Each situation is completely unique to the relationships of that particular social group. So both the book and the study alluded to the fact that these emotional interactions and the motivations behind them, and it's just very complex. And then finally, the question at the end of chapter 11 of this week's reading was, how do we produce caring individuals in a world that is too often spoiled by selfishness and greed? Quote unquote. That's from page 281. So I would suggest that perhaps in order to answer that question, we might shift some of our attention to approaches that are not limited to evolution, genetics, or socialization experiences. So thank you for your attention. I hope you found this study interesting, and I hope you're all staying safe.